There was an anointing on this man's life. He had a message people needed to hear. It's a message that continues to come out. People continue to accept Christ reading this story.
All right, so I got a book here, Pilgrims Progress. It's the pocket edition. And when I say the name John Bunyan, your first thought with the name Bunyan, I'm thinking of the lumberjack, but that's a different Bunyan, right?
That's Mr. John.
So before we dive into the story in the book, let's talk about who John Bunyan was, and then we'll get into the story. So who was this guy, John Bunyan?
John Bunyan was born in 1628. It was a time of turbulent English history. In the same era, the saying was, absolute power corrupts absolutely. The kings had absolute power. John Bunyan grew up in Bedford, England. He fought in the Civil War that successfully ended King Charles' reign. After the war was won, he took up the family trade and he married a Puritan wife. He accepted Christ and became a pastor who preached to thousands, and he was a man of revival. Standing firm in faith, he did not compromise, but held as his banner, we need to be born again in order to be saved. It was a radical concept in an era where churches taught social gospel. The author's faithfulness to preach regardless of the cost, writing 59 books from a jailhouse cell, impacts billions even today. His family loyally stood by him. His church community aided him with necessities. Even prisoners encouraged him to write, and he did. He was born in the era where the Puritans were having a lot of impact on England. And so we've already, 1620, we started right after that having almost 1,000 Puritans heading off to America, born again. Yay, we love that. But there was still a lot that were in England. And so they were having this impact. And so we at age 17, he goes into this army. A guy named Oliver Cromwell, who was a Puritan, took over and won the
Civil War.
Yeah, and so they had the Commonwealth for like 11 years, but he died of natural causes after 9. But at age 17, our John Bunyan, he's out there and he's going to be a guard.
He's not a Christian. He's very profane. I mean, he could curse.
He did a good job of that, didn't he?
Wonderfully, fluently.
Mm-hmm. He was well-versed in it, huh?
Yeah, he was well-versed, and he was good at it.
But God was already protecting him because he went out as a guard, and his buddy said, hey, let me take your shift for you. And so he goes out, and his buddy gets shot between the eyes. So John Bunyan has his first supernatural saving in preparation for where he's going to be going.
So is that what brings him to God? Is that what gives him...
Interesting. He got married. He said he was poor as a church mouse, as we often say. His wife was super poor too. And all the dowry that she was able to bring to the marriage were 2 Puritan books, one of which was called The Plain Man's Pathway to Heaven. And he was not inclined to pray or go to church. He was happy being a heathen. He read these books and they started him on a journey.
And then we have this lady who runs a candy shop, and she's a cusser.
She's not a Christian.
No,
by any means.
And so he's in there just cussing up a storm, and she looked at him and says, you cuss more than I do.
Yeah.
And that just hit him. Like, am I that bad of a person?
Because you've been listening to her.
Right.
Must have really been impressive.
Oh, yeah. So it started on this road of self-righteousness. I'm going to stop cussing. I'm going to be the best little person I can be and be religious. So he became religious.
So he was getting there by works.
But then he met a guy named John Gifford, a pastor. And John Gifford explained that there was more. There was salvation that was potential. There was a forgiveness of sin experience that was possible. And so he's like, what is all this about? And he hears these ladies from this church, and it's New Bedford, and they're talking about the things, salvation And he'd never ever heard that before. And so he's like, hey, I got to do something about this.
All right, so let's fast forward a little bit. So he gets saved.
Mm-hmm.
He's had this progress of understanding who he is and becoming a Christian. And how, history says he spent time in jail. What was that all about?
Well, he starts off by preaching, and then Oliver Cromwell, who's been running his country, he dies of natural causes. And in the interim, now the King Charles II jumps back onto the throne.
And he outlaws anyone who preaches who's not ordained by the state church.
You can't have more than five people in a meeting outside the church, or you'll get thrown in jail.
So Joe, during this era, because we're in like 1600s now.
That's right.
In the preaching outside the Church of England, that was a pretty big deal, wasn't it?
Well, he was allowed to for so many years.
Under Cromwell.
And then he's gone, and now they passed this law that he couldn't preach.
Conventicle
Very
Act.
restricted.
Mm-hmm.
And so he got caught. He was sneaking off, preaching to this group. He got caught, and he was brought before the magistrate, and he says, okay, you're going to jail. So he was there for a little while. But he had an option. The option was if he would stop preaching, he could get out of jail. Well, no, I'm going to preach. So he goes back into jail.
John Bunyan had a choice. He only had to abandon the church he founded and stop preaching about the new birth. Come rejoin the Anglican Church. The heathen leadership of King Charles II was evil. Would John Bunyan do this? Would he adopt the liberal lifestyle of King Charles' court? John Bunyan was committed to not denying Christ. He said, I would rather remain in jail until moss grows on my eyelids than fail to do what God has commanded me.
Yeah.
So Joe, if he's preaching anyway, did he know what was about to happen to him?
Oh, yes. They told him.
They told him he would get arrested.
Right. He didn't care.
And so it's not like today where they actually feed you in jail.
It's
like
true.
you had to supply your own food. There was no social security.
And the family would bring your
And
food.
the family
Oh,
would.
yes.
But he had a poor young family, the dowry, as I said earlier, that his wife brought in the family, it was 2 books. He said we had no spoon, we had no chair, we had no table. They had nothing to start off with. But he was so on fire for God. Crowds would just flock to hear him. This guy,
1,200, 3,000.
he loved the Lord. He could tell a story. And of course, there was no entertainment. So just people would just...
He was a storyteller.
He was a storyteller, and but he wasn't theologically trained. No, but he was a man of the Bible. He fed on the word, and it just poured out of him. And he's got 60 sermons that he wrote, and just to read them, it just flows like a river flowing out of him. He was full of God and full of life.
Personally, John Bunyan he's my hero. He, though, never wasted any time in jail. He didn't bemoan his situation. He used it to the glory of God. He would speak with other prisoners, other denominations apart from his own in the jail. So he would often have debates with, for instance, the Quakers. And it was through this debate that he eventually got into writing in the first place. He would preach to the prisoners, because he believed he was where God wanted him to be. And it's rather ironic if John had not gone to jail, because we would not have known of John Bunyan of Bedford, because he would not have been in jail to write and ultimately write the Pilgrims Progress.
So when the time came, okay, so the judge, says to him, we've changed the law, and if you continue to preach, you'll go to jail. But the judge says, do you have a wife and family, and do you love them? And he says, I do, more than anything, but I hate them compared to how much I love God, Yeah. So all he gets is a 3-month sentence. Now, it's not as if you can't be a Christian. It's not as if we will kill you if you profess faith. He could be a Christian. He had to go to his local Anglican church. That's all he had to do, and stop preaching to these crowds of people. I'm sure all his friends said, look, you've got a wife and family. And he had a hard time over this because he said, I feel that I'm bringing the house down over my wife and my children. His children would visit him and they'd leave.
He
and
had
he's
one
on his
daughter
own.
that was born blind.
So he had every excuse to not do what he did.
But imagine a nation, a circumstance where you have to go to a particular church or you're going to be fined or jailed. That's what these people had.
Or
that's what started
in some
America.
cases I read they even hanged him for preaching.
Oh yeah, there were people
Yes.
who died. And so all this story.
That make you reevaluate your career.
Yeah,
Oh, yes.
yes. So after 3 months, he can go home. He can go home.
And so what does he do? All he's got to do is say he'll go to
well,
the
did he
Anglican
last
church.
3 months or 6 months or 12 months? Gene, it was 12 years.
So for 12 years, he said, no, I won't do that.
And the only reason he got out was that the king, under political pressure, because we had a king, but in those days we had a parliament, and the parliament was what raised the taxes to fund what the king wanted to do. And so there was a whole struggle going on there. So the king backed off, and when he backed off and said, okay, you Puritans, if you get licensed and ordained, we will allow you to do this. So he stuck by his guns and his faith. He did not compromise.
What was so cool is he'd have favor with the jailers, and they'd let him out, and
He was
he'd go
allowed outside.
preach
He'd be
to his
preaching
congregation.
and preaching. And,
Wait. So he's in jail and he's able to go out and preach?
Yep.
Yep.
But one day he was going to go out and do it, and he had this unction. Oh, I shouldn't do this. So he goes back into jail, and he finds out that his jailer's boss shows
just
up.
showed up.
And if he'd gone and preached, his jailer would have gotten in trouble. And so his jailer comes in to look, and he's like, oh, and he sees John Bunyan.
So it wasn't like a huge, dark, deep, torture chamber kind of dungeon,
Right.
but he was still.
But he
said,
wasn't free.
No,
obviously.
he said, every time my children leave me, it's like pulling the flesh off my bones.
Yeah.
And I'm sure he had dark times in that.
He made and sold shoelaces to help his family be supported.
And they would sell them on the market to support themselves.
And he wrote. He was a
Right.
writer.
So did he start really writing while he was in prison? And so you're telling me that's where this book came from?
It's a prison book, Gene.
And 59 other books just like that. But this one was the one that hit the bestseller and continues to this day to be massive. in
Well, I
sales.
mean, an average home would have a Bible and John Bunyan's Pilgrims Progress.
So he wrote this book, Pilgrims Progress. So what's it about? It's a story. It's not real. It's a story. So what's it about?
The Pilgrims Progress was released in February 1678. At first, Bunyan was not intending for it to be published, but his friends said it was worthy of publication. So reluctantly, he went to a publisher. It's probably somebody he met in his time in the army, because the publisher came from Newport Pagnell in Buckinghamshire. The book itself is really the narrative of the Christian life.
Doug, tell me, who's the story about?
Well, it's about the story of a man who's on a journey, and all he knows that he's in a city called the City of Destruction, and he's trying to get to this place he knows is out there, but he's not sure, called the Celestial City. But he's carrying a burden, Gene, and in the book, it's as though he's got this huge weight on his shoulders, like 100-pound kind of, backstack kind of thing. And so he stumbles around trying to find heaven. And he doesn't know where he's going, but God sends helpers along his way.
Mr. Evangelist.
Evangelist comes
and
along.
Evangelist points to the mountains and says, oh, there's the celestial city.
And he can barely see it.
And from start to finish, the book, A Life from Destruction to the Celestial City. Bunyan has read a book. Now, of course, that book is the Scriptures itself. And he sees his need as a sinner of salvation. And he's seeking to be rid of this sin that is like a burden that presses him down. Now, he may have been referring in his thoughts to the anvil that he would have worn on his back as he travelled around Bedford as a tinker in his trade. Through this story, He depicts situations that occur in a Christian life. Meeting people that will try and help, but they're not really helping at all. If anything, they're sending you in another direction. He depicts certain scenarios, such as the slough of despondency. He talks about the narrow way and the broad way, being shown the light by Mr. Evangelist, which may well have been the minister of the church that he joined in Bedford. That minister's name was Mr. John Gifford.
And so he starts on a journey.
He starts on a journey. And that's the important thing. He leaves his family, because his family say, you're crazy. And he's really telling his own, journey as a young Christian on how he came to faith.
And everybody tried to stop him. Everybody tried to talk him out of it, but he was set on that course.
And the first problem that happens with this guy who has a huge burden on his back is he falls into slough?
The slough of despond, which is no word for just a bog or a marsh.
Swamp.
Yeah, swamp, whatever. And it's like, so his friend, who's called Pliable, says, I'm not following you.
A friend who's called Pliable.
Yeah, i.e., or, has no backbone.
Yeah, I understand. I understand Pliable.
There we go.
I need more of those friends.
Yeah, that's right. And so it's like, oh my word, I thought we were going to this great celestial city, and now this, I'm leaving. So all of a sudden, our poor Pilgrim, he's on his own.
He is. It's a raw experience, because this is a guy who's literally in jail, but he's writing about this pilgrim who's so courageous, and he talks about that courage to step out towards what's going to be that faith journey. And so
he gets out of the bog, and he meets somebody, Mr. Worldly Wiseman.
Yeah, that's great.
Who's Mr. Worldly Wiseman?
It's his, friends.
So he's looking at morality. Is that going to be my salvation? Is that going to be my solution? And Evangelist, he berates him. He says, hey, why are you listening to this guy? What's wrong with you? And get back on the narrow path. Keep it going. And so, of course, he heads to the wicket gate.
And that's a small gate. That's all it is. So it wasn't a big highway. He had to go through this small place to find salvation.
Yeah.
So he gets to the interpreter's house, you're saying, who's really the Holy Spirit. And so what happens after that point?
Well, he then comes to the cross.
What do you mean he comes to the cross? He finds the cross on his journey?
Yes.
Yes.
A gentle slope.
And he commits his life to Jesus Christ. From that big burden is lifted off of him, but he's also given a certificate for heaven. That comes in play later on. Yeah. But he has that certificate, or a passport that he could go into heaven.
It really keeps you on the edge of your seat. It's like, how is this guy going to ever survive this great, journey that he's on?
So he goes up a difficulty hill, and he hits Palace Beautiful. And, you'd think that'd be pretty cool, right? Palace Beautiful. But there's lions in front of it.
Oh,
lions.
Dangers at every
Well,
turn.
He's heading to this place, and there's two people come back and say, it's awful, turn back, don't do it. So all these naysayers, and they said, there's lions down there and they'll devour you. So it's, he's at a quandary again. It's like, oh my Lord, what have I got myself into? It's just keeping you on the edge of your seat. So he finally goes, so he walks past these lions and they don't touch him. After he gets past them, he realizes, oh, they were chained lions. He's passed a big test. Each thing is a journey, and he grows through that.
So once he's got this armor and this weaponry, then he has a challenge in the valley of humiliation. He has a challenge in the valley of the shadow of death, which is just like Psalms 23. Yea, though I pass through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. And so he's learning to build this trust and relationship with this person that has saved him on the cross.
He talks about a fight with Apollyon, with Satan, using the scriptures as his defense. So he has a sword in one hand and a shield in the other. And he almost expires his life in fighting this foe. But his faith holds fast, and the devil flees from him. He meets characters on the journey, such as helpful, faithful, He goes to places such as House Beautiful and meets 3 sisters that reside there with their father. Now that house is actually representing the Church of God on earth. As he leaves that house to carry on his journey, he's given armour. Must I wear this? You will need it in the journey. Now that armour is spoken about in the book of Ephesians, in Scripture, Ephesians chapter 6. The helmet of salvation, the belt of truth, the shoes prepared for the gospel, and so on. All this type of thing is mentioned in the Pilgrim's Progress.
He finally gets a helper.
Oh my gosh, Faithful is one of my favorite characters. You go, he and Faithful go to Vanity Fair, and it's not like a normal town. It's a town that is full of all the vices and decadences and all this sort of stuff. And here's Faithful saying, I'm committed to this road. I'm going to get to that celestial city. And he pays the ultimate price. And I remember when I first read this, I was like 9, 10 years old, and I was just shocked. It was like, I loved Faithful, and now he's dead. And what a brutal place. And it gives you that experience in real life of John Bunyan's courage, because he was dealing with a brutal place, and he didn't know if he was going to make it or not. And in this circumstance, Faithful doesn't.
And he's back on his own again. So you'd think he'd learn a lot. And so he leaves Vanity Fair, and instantly they find a shortcut, Gene.
Always a shortcut.
There's always a shortcut. And it's like, oh, this is really good. So the picture is this path that they're supposed to stay on, but his buddy says, hey, you don't need to go on this rocky path, because it had gotten a bit rocky by then.
It was a wide path.
Yeah, right. And
it's, let's go on the wide path.
And so
a
let's cut across
Vanity
this
Fair
field and do
showed
this. And it's like, well, what a great idea I just had. I'm going to do it my way instead of God's way. And
right.
Guess what? They get in trouble.
He gets kidnapped by the giant.
In Doubting Castle and Giant of Despair.
Yep.
They're prisoners again.
All right.
How did this happen? And, beating up on himself.
This is not an encouraging story so far.
But my favorite place is when they hit Delectable Mountains, because now you've got Christian, you've got Hopeful, and they find all sorts of gardens and vineyards and fountains of water, and 4 shepherds show up. Experienced, knowledge, watchful, and sincere. And they tell them these mountains are the Lord's. So here he's had this huge, challenging journey up to this point, and now they're in the mountain of the Lord. And so they continue on from there to the country of Beulah, and that should be a name that kind of... And it's a happy land.
And so each time he's getting closer to this place called the Celestial City.
And Beulah's right outside the Celestial, but there's one more test.
Oh dear, is he going to pass it?
I remember thinking at this point, this guy's been through everything.
So what's the whole thing about Dark River? What was that?
They had to look for how to cross it. It was very, very dangerous, and it took faith to get through it.
Yes, because you couldn't take a boat and go there was no works way of getting. It's almost like you had to be prepared to drown to cross this. And
so it was a faith journey.
It was a faith journey.
It wasn't something you could do in the natural. Well, they crossed it successfully, and coming to Celestial City, the 2 shining ones were waiting there for the pilgrims, and they helped them up. And so we had the end of the journey, which I think is so cool, because John Bunyan had success too in his journey. So no matter how many people had challenges around him in such a brutal time period of England's history, you have this happy experience of what John Bunyan did, and thousands upon thousands of people accepted Christ through his ministry.
And happy is not, he was full of joy, full of God, and people loved to hear him preach. He had the life of God in him. He didn't come out of jail a depressed, beaten down man, because he decided nothing's going to hold me down. And we are still enjoying that journey here today.
So why do you think Pilgrim's Progress became such, we would say it's a hit, a blockbuster?
It was. It is.
There was nothing like it.
Because it was it wasn't a book of facts. It was actually a story. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, there was nothing like that. I mean, the novel was not invented until this time. He wrote probably the first English novel that was written, and that was new to people, where they could read a story and make spiritual sense out of it. And that really warmed a lot of people to seek God and seek Jesus.
Wow.
There was an anointing on this man's life. He had a message people needed to hear. It's a message that continues to come out. People continue to accept Christ reading this story.
It's full of the word. He was a word man. And so, okay, so who did he influence? Well, I grew up with C.S. Lewis's books and the Narnia stories. That he influenced C.S. Lewis.
Oh, really? Wow.
William Carey.
Charles Dickens, A Christmas, so a Christian allegory is still powerful today.
John Bunyan chose to be the one in his generation. Today, John Bunyan's greatest work, Pilgrims Progress, continues to inspire and bring people to Christ. Imagine this was the first novel ever written. It's a parable, yet it's real life. We have a man in a city that is destined for destruction. His author is in jail for 12 years with no idea if he would ever be set free. We follow Pilgrim's journey from destruction to salvation. John Bunyan is finally released from jail with years of successful, published books that allowed him to end his days a notable preacher, with many finding Jesus. Yet, his greatest achievement is people are still learning we can be saved. This story was and continues to be the #2 bestseller of all time, right behind the Bible.
So, Joe, what do we take from this whole story?
Well, he's been affecting a generation after generation, 350 years. He showed what perseverance was. He pioneered where people didn't see this. People didn't read this. They read Bible stories, but they didn't. It was a new communication style, a novel. And so he got out of prison. He actually wrote this. He went back to prison, and he wrote it in his one more year. He had to do prison. And that's when he did Pilgrim's Progress. And it became a bestseller. They printed it on this kind of like cheap paper, and they couldn't keep up with it. They couldn't print them fast enough. Made him a very wealthy man, influenced generations to come, and he would preach to crowds and crowds. He became one of the best known speakers in England at that time. And he went and preached right up to his death. He was in London to help somebody out. He was on the horse, a storm came, he got the chills, he got pneumonia, and he died. But he was still helping everybody.
Preaching the word.
And they have taken that book. I think it was printed in over 200 languages today.
Wow.
It's the #1 seller in English language, still being printed. It's never going out of print. Never going out of print.
Wow.
Still affecting people today.